Thank you. I feel like Chevy Chase on the old, Saturday Night Live thing. So in December of 1974, the attack begins, and it's pretty dramatic. By January of 1975, the PRG gains control of the entire province here. As I said, near the Cambodian border, just like 50 miles from Saigon. The ARVN barely resisted. ARVN was in retreat. The level of desertion was quite high, and the American B-52s did not reappear. President Gerald Ford, at the time Nixon has resigned because of Watergate. Ford considered it, but nobody encouraged this at all. Saigon, when Van Tu had continued to hold out hope that the Americans would at the last minute come to the rescue. That didn't happen. Ford put some feelers out, and Congress shot them down immediately. Nobody wanted any more part of this. So Hanoi was thrilled. Le Duan said, "Never have we had military and political conditions so perfect or a strategic advantage so great as we have now." General Van Tien Dung then planned to cut the RVN in half, driving from the Central Highlands to the South China Sea. So the idea is to cut the country in half, cut the RVN in half totally. And as Ron pointed out, there's not a whole lot going on in the north anyway. In the middle of March, then, 3 PAVN divisions attack Ban Mi Tuo right here, which is about 150 miles or so from Saigon, Ban Mi Tui. And the ARVN basically didn't even fight. They thought the attack was a diversion. The ARVN basically was in constant retreat towards Saigon throughout the entire offensive, trying to protect the capital. And so within 3 days, Ban Mi Tui falls. At that point, the PRG is actually having trouble keeping up with the ARVN's retreat. And they decided at that point to go for the kill, to shoot for the capital. When Van Tu had abandoned the Central Highlands, was calling for a basically 100% reinforcement. Almost all troops that were still, together, all units that were still in one piece, retreated towards Saigon and toward the Delta. General Dung, in the meantime, has forces attack Hue, Da Nang, and Kon Tum, and all of these fall. So the Vietnamese, the NLF, the PRG, is now in control of most of Vietnam, most of southern Vietnam. Really the only areas in March of 1975 that haven't fallen yet are Saigon and parts of the Delta. It's pretty hairy situation. Tuesdays were numbered. The PRG actually offered to negotiate based on the idea that Tu would resign and they would have a coalition government. He refused. By late mid-April, Gerald Ford puts a request into Congress to send $700 million to the RVN. Congress shoots that down. When Van Tu finally quits, although the U.S. does loan him aircraft to get a few shots in at the end. On April 26th, General Van Tien Dung begins the Ho Chi Minh campaign, and the RVN at that point fully collapsed. This is when you see the scenes of the helicopters in the embassy scrambling. Over 7,000 American and South Vietnamese personnel get out of the capital. American ships in the South China Sea evacuate another 70,000 Vietnamese. The initial evacuees generally were people who were associated with the government in the South or with the Army. They tended to be officials, people who had connections who could get out. On April 30th, 1975, in scenes that you've probably seen on basically any documentary about Vietnam, the tanks roll toward the presidential palace and storm through the gates and either liberate or conquer Saigon, and they fly the Provisional Revolutionary Government flag from the balcony. Saigon is changed to Ho Chi Minh City, and in Hanoi, crowds begin chanting, "Long live Ho Chi Minh." It is a day of national independence. This war that has been going on for the better part of the 20th century, clearly since September of 1945, when Ho Chi Minh was denied independence, has finally ended. General Tran Van Tra, who led the final assault, he just died a year or two ago, was overtaken with emotion, and he said, "Suddenly I felt as if my soul was translucent and light, and if everything had sunk to the bottom." Again, the warrior poet. So the war, it seemed, was finally over. on April 30th, 1975. At that very same time, within the week, Cambodia and Laos fall as well. So you have within this very short period in April and May of 1975, the domino theory seemed to be validated. The Pathet Lao won in Laos, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and the National Liberation Front Provisional Revolutionary Government in Vietnam. This was called the Great Spring Offensive. Okay, as often happens, however, winning a war is only the start, and much, much greater problems emerge from that, and that was basically the case in Vietnam. There are a lot of aftermaths about it, and I'm just going to quickly go through some of them with regard to both Vietnam and with the United States, because I think Vietnam is still very much with us today. Just a few months before he died, I had mentioned Ho Chi Minh had written his final testament asking to be cremated and whatnot. But in it, he also envisioned that our rivers, and Ho was a poet to the end, excuse me, our rivers, our mountains, our people will always be. The American aggressors defeated, we will build a country 10 times more beautiful. And anybody who's ever studied revolutions and reconstructions and war know how difficult it is to rebuild afterward. And in Vietnam's case, it would be more difficult than many. By 1975, and I think this is a striking point that's very important, by 1975, the destruction, both northern and southern, was devastating. It was horrible on both sides of the 17th parallel. It was, almost incomprehensible to see lush jungle turned into, a barren landscape because of B-52s, because of herbicides, villages totally wrecked, millions of refugees in the capital city. So the destruction was horrific. In addition to that, I think more importantly than that, the social bitterness was so deep by 1975 that rebuilding is going to be that much more difficult. To throw a counterfactual out there, if the war had ended in 1960 or in 1968, clearly the level of bitterness, the hatred would not have been as great. And there's always the possibility that some kind of a different society could have been created. But after fighting a war that lasts, how many years? Let's say 45, the French War begins. So after fighting a 30-year war, after seeing family members killed, generations killed, grandfathers, fathers, and sons could all have died in various phases of the Indochina War, the First or Second Indochina War. The level of bitterness becomes so great by that time that the Vietnamese are far less willing to let bygones be bygones, to accommodate themselves to this new status. And payback begins. Reeducation camps, basically prisons, begin to crop up throughout the South. At first officials from the government and the army are put in. Some people stay in these reeducation camps for 20 years. The most salient characteristic is the devastation and the anger, the bitterness in both sides. Because of that, you have mass epidemics, starvation, poverty. The structure of traditional society in Vietnam has been radically altered. Remember, when the war begins, this is basically a poverty-ridden, it's an agricultural country. Poverty in Western scales, but in a sense, a subsistence economy. So even though, by our standards, they would have been terribly poor, people actually were eking out a living. So it's a traditional agrarian society, but in a very incredibly short period of time, the United States floods this traditional society with technology, with money, with consumer culture, with advertising, and they reverse a lot of these cultural values, this adherence to the village. Villages are being uprooted and destroyed. So as a result of that, Vietnamese find that they can get involved in the drug trade or in the black market or in prostitution and make in a week what they would otherwise have to work a year in the fields to get. Perhaps hundreds of thousands of young Vietnamese women become prostitutes because it's so lucrative. The drug trade flourishes with basically the support of the Vietnamese government. And so not surprisingly, the native Vietnamese resent this. Just as a lot of Americans, as we've said before, do not speak well of the ARVN and the GVN. Well, the converse of that is that a lot of Vietnamese believe that the Americans came in there, encouraged them to fight this war, you know, to the point where they actually undermine attempts by Vietnamese leaders to negotiate a settlement. Never treated the Vietnamese as equals, looked upon them with contempt, introduced many Western vices into their society. It's not to suggest, I mean, prostitution and drugs occur everywhere, but nowhere near on the level that they became because of the American presence in Vietnam. Had an army. I've heard Vietnamese talk about this. You know, they always talk. You know, I've heard some Vietnamese say, I've always, you know, hear Americans talking about how bad the ARVN is. What about the American army? They were a bunch of, you know, drug-addled people who were, you know, attacking us all the time. You know, probably stereotypes on both sides, but nonetheless, there's a real sense that, you know, the Vietnamese were betrayed by the Americans. You encouraged us to fight this war. You poured money and soldiers and resources in, and then you betrayed us. You know, you left us out to dry. You know, after 1973, you did nothing. You said, okay, it's your war now, after encouraging us for this long. So there's a real sense of betrayal on both sides. And in Vietnam, because of the bitterness and hatred, those who were associated with the Americans were clearly targeted. Not at all, despite, you know, the rhetoric, nothing like Cambodia. There were not mass killings. I've not seen evidence of that. Okay, and I mean, you'll occasionally see, clearly Reeducation Camps, you know, prisons, basically, which, you know, probably hundreds of thousands, probably more than 100,000 Vietnamese were put in these, some for 2 decades. But I have not seen any evidence of mass graves or anything at all, like what happened in Cambodia, which was just outrageous. I mean, just a grossest violation of human rights. But at the same time, Vietnam clearly has problems. As Pham Van Dong very subtly put it, waging a war is simple, but running a country is very difficult. Making it even more difficult was Hanoi's inability to get help. Now remember, I had mentioned before, there was a secret codicil in the 1973 peace treaty, which is I reproduced in the Reader, in which Nixon promises about $3.5 billion to Hanoi, reconstruction money. They never get that. All right? The new country is called the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, the SRV. They don't get that money. They go to international loaning agencies like the IMF, the World Bank, the International Bank for Reconstruction Development. They can't get money there either because the U.S. essentially controls these mechanisms. So Vietnam immediately finds itself in a huge hole. It does not have access to outside capital, and its country has been mobilized for war for so long. Now, Gabriel Kolko will argue that they took that situation and made the worst of it. The type of organization that had worked so well during the war, kind of this central planning and so forth, they kind of abandoned and they kind of turned toward market-oriented reforms. But they clearly have outside problems as well. There are great aftermaths. One is economic. The other is that they do not have peace for long. Within a few years, Vietnam finds itself back at war again, and against against its neighbors, actually. Remember in 1978, 1975, I'm sorry, the Khmer Rouge come to power. Hanoi, in 1978, sees the Khmer Rouge as a threat. The Khmer Rouge is closely associated with the Chinese. So you have, it's kind of get confusing here, Cambodia and China, the People's Republic of China, are now seen as problems by the Vietnamese. The Khmer Rouge is supported by the Chinese, and the Chinese don't like the Vietnamese. Remember way back when the Vietnamese, when Ho Chi Minh was still alive, were getting aid from both China and the Soviet Union, and essentially had remained very close to the Chinese, but the Chinese were always trying to drive the Vietnamese away from the USSR, and it's incredibly Byzantine stuff. To cut to the quick, in 1968, Ho essentially steps closer to the USSR, goes into negotiations, which the Chinese didn't want. So old animosities, which never had really subsided, emerge again. And by 1978, Mao Zedong's successor, Mao, dies in 1976, I'm sorry. Mao's successor is Deng Xiaoping, and he promises to teach a lesson to the, quote, ungrateful and arrogant Vietnamese. Ungrateful and arrogant. It's kind of like LBJ talking about black Americans. Deng Xiaoping's talking about the Vietnamese. He calls them dogs. The old animosities are up again. So the Chinese and the Cambodians, essentially the writings on the wall, they're out to get Vietnam. And the Vietnamese aren't being paranoid about this. Yeah?
Briefly, what is the basis for the link between the Cambodians and the Chinese? Is it just primarily ideological, or is there?
Well, there's a lot of that, and their hatred of Vietnam. I mean, they both believed that Vietnam was an aggressor. They believed that Ho and his successors were out to create an Indo-Chinese confederation with Vietnam in charge. There's an ideological affinity, too. I mean, clearly Pol Pot, and I think he's even crazy by Maoist standards, but clearly the type of things Pol Pot does, this kind of agrarianism, I mean, he gets it from the Cultural Revolution. That's where the idea comes from, when China was trying to eradicate these Western influences. And it's quite striking because in both cases what you have are young zealots. The scariest part of images from the Cultural Revolution and from Cambodia is like 12-year-old kids with AK-47s just going crazy, going medieval and randomly killing people and massacring them and torturing them. And so I think there's an ideological affinity, but I think by and large they're both frightened. And the part that no one talks about is the Americans are supporting both sides. I mean, the U.S. is out to get Vietnam. I mean, as I said before, I mean, I don't have a smoking gun on this, but I think the point was to make sure that Vietnam would have an impossible time of rebuilding. And this continues until after '75. It doesn't end when the war ends. So the United States is really, I think, fairly strongly yet tacitly supporting Cambodia and China against Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam has plenty of enemies. It hasn't lost them just because it's won the war. Because of that, Pham Van Dong, who succeeds Ho, decides to take preemptive measures. And on Christmas Day, 1978, begins an attack, a Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia into the capital, Phnom Penh. And this thing, again, just they slice through. And within 2 weeks, they capture Cambodia. They place a new government in power. They leave 120,000 troops, 120,000 Vietnamese troops remain in Cambodia, and they close the killing fields. I say this without a hint of sarcasm. Pham Van Dong should have won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979 for doing that. If they could give it to Kissinger, they could have given it to Pham Van Dong. I don't care what the reasons were. He ended the killing. The massacre stopped. Not that he was a humanitarian, but the massacres did stop. That probably wasn't the reason for intervention, although that clearly was the reason that Pham Van Dong gave. We intervened, we invaded to stop the killing. And I mean, the Vietnamese, ethnic Vietnamese were one of the targeted groups for genocide. The fact was, I think, it was a preemptive measure because he saw the U.S., China, and Cambodia essentially conspiring against Vietnam. But the killing stopped. The killing fields were ended. The great irony, as I said before, was that because the government instituted, I believe it was a man named Heng Sam-rin, who was quite young at the time, was considered a Vietnamese puppet. He was a Vietnamese lackey. He was Cambodian, but he was closely associated with the Vietnamese communists. Because he was considered a puppet of Vietnam, the United States continued for the next decade to vote against seating Heng Sam-rin at the United Nations. And people, good anti-communists like Al Haig and Jeane Kirkpatrick, continued to support the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot at the UN as the official government of Cambodia. It's ugly. It's just outrageous, right? It's unbelievable, right? The Khmer Rouge hated the Vietnamese. That was all that mattered for the United States. The fact that they'd killed perhaps 1 million or more of their own people didn't matter. Now, about 6 weeks after the Vietnamese had invaded and I would say liberated Cambodia, about 6 weeks after that, in March of 1979, China, and there are pretty good evidence that Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Brzezinski had met with the Chinese and had given them clear signals that the U.S. would not have any problems with the Chinese invasion of Vietnam. Brzezinski had basically green-lighted the whole thing. So in March of 1979, China invades Vietnam in the north, right, into the Tonkin area, and there they meet over 100,000 regional and local militia groups. The Vietnamese were outnumbered 2 to 1. They suffered huge losses. However, they forced the Chinese to retreat with 20,000 casualties. Wow. They defeated the French, they defeated the Americans, the Cambodians, and then they kicked China's butt again. But for Hanoi, the wars would just not end. One thing that Coco points out in his cover is the costs of Cambodia and China were huge, and this also is a major problem in reconstruction. Coco, I think, is a bit critical of the Cambodian adventure. I tend to think that the Vietnamese, whether you agree with them morally or not, had good reason to suspect Cambodia at that time. I really think that, yeah.
Well, he says that they couldn't afford to invade Cambodia. And also the invasion from China.
Yeah.
On getting even with Vietnam, you know, we're going to get even with these dogs. Well, that cost them a lot, too.
It did. I mean, I think, you know, I don't see how they could have avoided the Cambodian invasion, because if not, when China invades, you're probably going to see a second front, or, you know, that's a risk. The Cambodian, I think it makes sense. I mean, I tried to be kind of cold, you know, calculating about it, but I don't think Pham Van Dong was being paranoid to think that they were out to get him, because they were. And I mean, the Americans, Big Nut Brzezinski had basically given green lights, you know, clear signals toward that end. Yeah.
Besides the green light, did America actually give hardware
Didn't need to.
the Khmer Rouge?
No.
Oh.
Well, no, not the Khmer Rouge. Although they're fighting with plenty of leftover American equipment. Well, no, not so much there, actually. That's China. China is the biggest patron of the Khmer Rouge. And it's kind of funny. I mean, it's totally Byzantine. I mean, Sihanouk also has refuge in China at the time. And Sihanouk comes back and becomes part of the ruling coalition after the Khmer Rouge are kicked out. It's totally bizarre stuff. Yeah. I mean, the cost of China and Cambodia for Vietnam are really, really huge. Coupled with their inability to get international money, it's a real crisis. There's no question about that. But the wars just won't end for Hanoi. And this leads to the type of situation I think that Coco talks about. Okay? What's the legacy of Vietnam? What's the aftermath of Vietnam at home in the United States? This is something obviously I'm very interested in, or else I wouldn't be here talking to you about it, you know, every Saturday at 1 a.m. I'll tell you, I'm going to get a better time, because I'm getting really tired staying up this late. So what's the legacy? I think it's the defining event of this generation, people who grew up in that period, and I would suggest it's still strong afterward. One of the reasons I got interested in this, because Vietnam just wouldn't go away culturally, in terms of policy debates. Right now we're in a presidential race where Al Gore and George Bush and John McCain and the rest of them are all talking about Vietnam in one way or the other. Gore, whether strings were pulled to give him a cushy assignment, or, you know, when George Bush was in the Air Guard, or John McCain, who was a POW. I mean, this is still with us. This is still part of the debate. And I think it'll continue to be for some time, except for the very young. Most people in this country have some, you know, knowledge, some memory of that era. And so I think the legacy, the aftermath of it, is quite strong. Now, what we normally hear, and I quite embarrassedly just noticed here that I left out a quotation mark, was that after Vietnam we had something called the Vietnam Syndrome. And I put down there fact or fiction, because I think that sometimes we kind of get people using that concept of Vietnam Syndrome to mean whatever they want. In general, the Vietnam Syndrome, as mainstream politicians and media use it, suggests that by the early to mid-1970s, when the war was winding down for the Americans, there was a sense that Vietnam had been a terrible mistake. And in fact, public opinion polls show that a majority of Americans believe that Vietnam was a mistake and was also morally wrong. So the argument goes, because there was this large-scale recognition of how terrible Vietnam was, that the country decided to step back and act with greater restraint in its affairs, that it would be a bit more introspective and pensive before undertaking new types of behavior that might bring on, quote, another Vietnam. And this is, you see this all the time. It becomes the guiding principle in American foreign policy. It implies that restraint and limits will be part of American foreign policy. Sometimes people who criticize it claim that Americans are handcuffed by it. People like Walt Rostow and Henry Kissinger will claim that because of the Vietnam Syndrome, the Angolan Civil War was won by the Marxists. Because of the Vietnam Syndrome, the Iranians felt like they could take aggressive action against the Americans in 1979, that the Soviet Union could be more aggressive, that Castro could go off without any checks and balances and so forth. This is kind of the flip side of it. This is the idea that Vietnam has made us think and we aren't able to act the way we once would. I think, there's some truth to that, obviously, but I think it's as much of a myth as a diplomatic characteristic. I think the Vietnam Syndrome has been invoked selectively to gain a particular political objective, and people who were against the war do the same thing. I mean, I've been part of groups that have done that. But I think most powerfully it connects to the whole we weren't allowed to win or we had to fight with one hand tied behind our back myth, which we can talk about a bit. Right after the war ends, there's kind of an attempt early on to rebuild the idea behind Vietnam, to kind of go back to the old Cold War ideals that brought upon the Vietnam War. In my own stuff in Masters of War, you kind of see parts of that where while the war's in progress, you have people like Harold K. Johnson and Admiral MacDonald saying, once this thing's over, we're going to be blamed for it, we're going to take the loss. LBJ amid Tet says, they're going to ask me for something, and no, I'm not going to give it to them, and all the blame's going to be on my shoulder. So while the war's in progress, they're thinking about how this thing's going to play afterward. At some point I said they're all trying to kind of erase their fingerprints from it. And so when the war ends, you see this immediately. And what you have are conservatives who begin to kind of reevaluate and rehabilitate the war. I think I've suggested this before, and not to equate Vietnam with World War II, but there's some good articles on the way in the interwar period between World Wars I and II, German nationalists, like Hitler, began to rebuild the history of World War I to justify the war and to suggest that the Germans were not defeated militarily during World War I, but it was all these weak civilians who undermined them, who sold them down the river. And you see a similar dynamic occur in the 1970s. And again, not to equate Nazis with the Americans. There's no Holocaust going on, but the historical revisionism is really quite striking and quite similar. So you start to see this idea emerge fairly early on. Actually, we won. Harry Summers is the most famous one in this regard, Colonel Harry Summers, who doesn't write his book until 1981. But at the beginning, he says that he recounts the story where he meets a PAVN commander, a Vietnamese commander, and he says, General, we won every single battle on the field. We won every military engagement on the battlefield. And according to Summers, this Vietnamese general looks at him, he says, that may be true, but it is also irrelevant. So the idea there is we kicked their butts militarily, but we weren't allowed to win. Either these politicians were weak, they were namby-pamby, they wouldn't let us invade the north, they wouldn't let us bomb Hanoi, or the anti-war movement were a bunch of treasonous punks guided by Hanoi, or it was Walter Cronkite's fault and the media sold us down the river, or it was Jane Fonda's fault, or whatever. So you start to get this sense that people are trying to rebuild and rehabilitate the war. And this idea that we can't act because of this Vietnam Syndrome is part of that. And that's the standard interpretation. But I think there are other aspects to it. For example, among military leaders, I think the Vietnam lessons are that they need to be more political. They need to prepare for war, but hopefully not fight one. Which is why, for example, in the 1980s, when the question of intervention in Latin America was quite prominent, the military, as much as anybody, didn't want to do that. Admiral William Crowe was constantly fighting with civilians about intervention in Latin America. When the United States invaded Panama in 1989, William Crowe was not crazy about that. Crowe and Elliott Abrams, who was and Richard Pearl, who were civilian undersecretaries, these guys were hawks, and Crowe had no use for them. They were always fighting. Crowe, as I said, wasn't thrilled about the Panama invasion. So to the military, this is the lesson. If you've read Colin Powell or Norman Schwarzkopf's memoirs about the Gulf War, and Schwarzkopf said we had all these John Wayne types, these civilians who wanted to go in and fight. Powell and Schwarzkopf wanted the sanctions to remain in place because they had both been, I believe they were both, well, no, Powell wasn't a field grade officer, but Schwarzkopf was, right? Yeah, but Powell had been...
Schwarzkopf had been a company commander, and Powell had been there twice, but I think they were both lieutenants and captains at a point where they saw people die in the battle.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the difference.
And Powell actually had helped with the investigation of My Lai. So they basically, the memory of Vietnam to them meant, we can prepare for this war and build up. but we'd rather not fight if we can avoid it. What else do they learn from Vietnam? If we are loyal to the president, because there was this real sense that the military and the civilians did not get along in Vietnam, especially LBJ. If we're loyal to the president, we can get more money. And in the Reagan era, that's clearly the case. We can take on Bill Clinton later because we can use his issue against him. So these are certain military lessons with regard to the Vietnam era. But do those hold up? What's the Vietnam syndrome mean? First, I'm really not sure that Vietnam, and this probably seems to fly in the face of things I've said before this, I'm not certain in some ways that Vietnam was that unpopular a war. Clearly there were huge anti-war movements, more public opposition to the war than you'll ever see before. But as cynical as Nixon could be, there was something of a silent group of people who probably did support it. And again, the polls, you can take public polling and do anything you want with it. As I said just a few minutes ago, majority of Americans think Vietnam was a mistake and morally wrong. At the same time, there were other polls indicating that people who opposed the war often did so because they wanted more done. I mean, people who voted for George Wallace, for instance, Wallace could be considered anti-war. He wanted to either shut up or put up or whatever. So you can see that. In general, you can find polling that indicate, with the exception of the Tet Offensive, that a lot of Americans still support the war. During the Cambodian crisis of 1970, about 2/3 supported Nixon because there was the sense that he was doing something. In addition to that, of course, as I said before, the media tends to be very favorable toward that, especially in the Kissinger years. Richard Nixon's reelected in 1972. Huge margin of victory. Again, McGovern tries to make Vietnam an issue. George McGovern's campaign motto that year is "Come Home, America." And he's ridiculed for it. He's derided for it. There's already this kind of backlash against that generation. McGovern is connected to the hippies and the crazies. Nixon says the election's about acid, amnesty, and abortion. And so you see this backlash already. The Christmas bombings, again, the media basically swallows those, hook, line, and sinker. The Paris Peace Accords, those are terms which were available much earlier, yet Nixon is generally acclaimed for it, and Kissinger wins the Nobel Peace Prize that year. Nixon also begins a series of arms sales. Once Vietnam de-escalates, the American military budget is drastically cut. I would argue that the government needs a significant military expenditures to keep the economy going. So in order to substitute for the cuts in Vietnam spending, Nixon begins a massive program of arms sales to the Third World, especially to Africa. And you see, especially in Africa, a series of civil wars throughout the 1970s, which I would argue can be directly traced to Nixon's arms sales. People like Jonas Savimbi and Mobutu, people like that, who spend, a lot of the African countries have actually a great deal of natural resources and a lot of money, and they begin to spend that on weapons rather than on development. The 1973 coup in Chile. Chile elects, in a free election in 1971, Salvador Allende, who's basically a socialist. And Allende gets on the wrong side of Anaconda Copper and some other American corporations, IT&T. And so in September of 1973, Allende is overthrown in a coup in which the CIA plays a very large part. What's this text, what's this roll call suggest? I'm not sure there's a Vietnam syndrome. It seems that the U.S. is acting in ways that are consistent with its behavior throughout the Cold War. There's popular support for the war. Nixon really doesn't pay the piper. Nixon gets nailed for Watergate, remember? Not for Vietnam. He's reelected. Kissinger's given the Nobel Peace Prize. Arms sales to the Third World make up these cuts in defense spending. He can overthrow the government of Chile. He's still, doing everything. America's still doing everything in its power to get rid of Castro. So, even before the war ends, while the war is still in progress, America continues to act aggressively, which I think runs counter to this idea that the Vietnam syndrome is making them act in a restrained fashion. After the war, I believe yeah.
Isn't the War Powers Act 1973?
Yeah, the War Powers Act, actually is the flip side of that. In 1973, Congress passes a law sponsored by Jacob Javits, who's a Republican from New York, that the president cannot go to war without congressional approval. I think it creates, a 60-day window there where you can commit American troops, but after 60 days you either have to withdraw them or get congressional approval of that. And this is a way for Congress to try to make the government more accountable, to take away that traditional flexibility in foreign policy. This is clearly a product of Vietnam. And, you know, it kind of sounds like I'm saying there's no Vietnam syndrome. All people clearly get different lessons from Vietnam. And I mean, the opponents of the war think that this is really a case where you cannot allow the president to have this kind of basically imperial, power. And Nixon was often mocked as King Richard, or people called his the imperial presidency. Not just radicals, liberals too. I mean, Nixon really very close to the bounds, not just in Watergate, but in foreign policy. I mean, the great irony is there is he gets in trouble for all the stuff he does at home. William Hungate, I think I quoted this before, said it's kind of crazy, you know, the bombings of Cambodia were actually originally listed as one of the articles of impeachment, but they took that out because it was foreign policy. And a congressman from Missouri, William Hungate, says it's kind of hard to live with yourself when you impeach a guy for tapping a telephone, but not for, you know, making illegal war against Cambodia. So, I mean, a lot of this, you know, I think some of that's about accountability. And I would argue the War Powers Act, a lot of it has to do with Nixon. I mean, people don't like the guy, and they're trying to hamstring him because they don't trust him. And a lot of that also has to do with the idea that Nixon may try to get back into Vietnam later on. I mean, when they do this, you know, Watergate hasn't really popped yet the way it would. So once the war is over, you start to see even more of this. The POW MIA issue, which Bruce Franklin talks about, is real interesting there. And again, as Franklin points out, I think, you know, overwhelming evidence, there is not a single piece of meaningful evidence to indicate that there are any live Americans being held against their will in Southeast Asia. All right, who says that? The CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon, every major investigative body. I think it's ironic. I mean, Reagan's people came to this conclusion. Reagan at first kind of played to this, we're going to get our boys back, but even Reagan's people had to admit, look, there's nothing there. Pop culture played into this and really created this kind of Rambo ethic, which indicated that, you know, we haven't won the war yet. We have to go back and get these guys out of captivity. And there's a large, you know, that's very receptive. I mean, as Franklin points out, this begins, you know, in 1973 with people like Ross Perot and Nixon, and it's a way to keep Americans focused on Vietnam, to keep them supporting the war. You know, they're not going to support the war anymore, so you have to find a hook. What's the hook? You know, our boys are there against their will, and we have to bring them home. All right, even though there's no evidence of that. So again, this idea that the Vietnam syndrome is restraining people, well, you have the MIA thing, which I think counters that quite effectively. You know, make sure you read Franklin, because there's some great stuff in there about that. Even in the presidency of Jimmy Carter, who was considered the great human rights president, Carter was asked at a press conference whether he would recognize the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The U.S. did not recognize him. And he said no, because, quote, the destruction was mutual. The destruction was mutual. Nobody had the, you know, quickness to say, how did North Vietnam destroy the United States, right? So this is the human rights president. Again, and Carter gets away with it. Most Americans actually are so tired of Vietnam by 1975, 76, 77, they just, you know, they don't want to hear about it anymore. It's something you'd rather erase from memory in many ways. So again, is this a Vietnam syndrome? What's the aftermath of this? You also see kind of a new Cold War emerge. So again, the idea that Vietnam restrains people, I'm saying, is very questionable. By the late 1970s, animosities are heating up. Now with Reagan, we're real clear on what that means, but it actually begins before that. Jimmy Carter gets off fairly easily because he's been building houses since he retired. But as president, Carter was aggressive and basically set the stage for Reagan very clearly. There's a real impetus by the time Reagan becomes president. Jimmy Carter, there was a debate within the Carter White House over who should control foreign policy. And it's eventually won by his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski was kind of a Henry Kissinger wannabe. He was a Polish emigre, he was from Harvard, and he took a real hard line. And Brzezinski wants to crack down. There's this sense that we're weak and people are taking advantage of us. Nobody likes us anymore. You know, we need to be tough again. So Brzezinski wins the battle for the heart and soul of Carter's foreign policy. As a result of that, Jimmy Carter is tries to prevent the Sandinistas from coming to power in Nicaragua in 1979. Carter proposes that the Organization of American States put together a coalition army to go into Nicaragua and prevent the Sandinistas who are leftists from taking over. He has no problem with that. The OAS shoots the idea down. Carter begins increasing defense budgets. Carter increases arms sales to the Third World, just as Nixon had. In 1979, when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, what does Carter do? Right? Carter boycotts the Olympics, and more importantly, he begins funneling tons of money to opposition groups in Pakistan called the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were young, many Islamic fundamentalist fighters opposed to the Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan. Okay, who do the Mujahideen in Afghanistan become? Anybody familiar with current events? Today's Taliban. Today, Afghanistan has a government which is not exactly liberal and open-minded. You know, women have to go out in public in veils. They're not allowed to be educated. They're not allowed to work. You know, people are having their hands cut off for violating Islamic law and things like that. These are guys who got American funding. These are the people who the United States sponsored during the war against Afghanistan. And this starts with Jimmy Carter. Right? Carter boycotts the Olympics. Carter begins to talk tough. He's often hassled during the Iranian hostage crisis for being weak. He was, you know, ridiculed as being weak. But in fact, Carter, you know, initially Iran asked to negotiate based on the idea that the U.S. acknowledged its role in the 1953 coup, which overthrew Mossadegh and put the Shah of Iran in power. Carter refused. And Carter was a perfect prelude into Reagan. Now, so you already have a kind of a new Cold War. Carter, remember, tries the Iranian rescue operation. Fails, but he does attempt that when against counsel. Oh, I think we were going to say something. Cyrus Vance was the Secretary of State who basically lost the battle with Brzezinski. Vance resigned after the rescue operation because he had opposed it. So Carter is, you know, again, is Carter restrained by Vietnam? I don't quite see it. I'm not sure what he could have done more than that. And then, of course, in the 1980s, you start to see this in great measure. You start to see what I call an ennobling of Vietnam. And I use that term because in 1980, the Republican candidate for president, Ronald Reagan, said that it was time that Americans realized that Vietnam was indeed a noble cause. Even before Reagan, though, you start to see kind of the writing on the wall. In the elections of 1978 and 1980, a large number of Vietnam-era Dove senators, people who had made names for themselves and been very outspoken against the war, were defeated in their re-election bids. People like Frank Church from Idaho, George McGovern from South Dakota, Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, Dick Clark from Iowa. The major, Ernest Gruening and Wayne Morse, the only two guys who voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, were both defeated. Now, there were local issues in all this as well, but the fact of the matter is that being a Vietnam Dove was not to your advantage in an election campaign. And of course, in 1980, Reagan really takes this to the next level. He claims Vietnam was a noble cause. We're suffering from this Vietnam syndrome. It's time that we get back off our feet. We need to be taken seriously. We need to become a superpower. So you get the Reagan arms buildup, which Carter had begun. Defense budgets had already begun to rise under Carter, and they become fairly astronomic, I would argue catastrophic, under Reagan. You get an intense increase in anti-Soviet rhetoric, unlike anything you've heard since the late 1940s. There had been in the Nixon period, you know, a thaw. I mean, Nixon had believed in détente, and so the U.S. and Soviet Union were tending to get along quite well. There had clearly been a thaw in relations. Reagan immediately ratchets that up. He calls the Soviet Union the greatest focus of evil in the modern world, and begins to take real serious action, you know, rhetorical actions against them. Puts forth the Star Wars plan, the Strategic Defense Initiative. The idea there will be that we can create a shield which will prevent nuclear weapons from attacking us. And, you know, the backdrop of this, we can win a nuclear war, which even Nixon had been loath to suggest. So, again, the Vietnam syndrome, if it's there, is real hard to see because in large measure, the U.S. continues to act as aggressively as ever. In the 1980s, the period of intervention in Latin America, you see that. In El Salvador, the United States supports the government there, run by many people who graduated from the School of the Americas, which is a training school in Fort Benning, where the Third World comes in and they're trained on things like torture as well as counterinsurgency tactics, which is all part of the same process. In El Salvador, the government there is essentially run by School of the Americas graduates, and the U.S. supports them. El Salvador used to get $2–3 million a year from the U.S. in aid. By the 1980s, it's getting $900 million from the United States for military support, which is being used by and large to suppress an insurgency there conducted by a group called the FMLN, the Farabundo Martí Liberation Group, National Liberation Organization. The government there is killing priests who are speaking on behalf of the people, the liberation theology movement. And the United States supports them. The United States puts together a group called the Contras in Nicaragua to fight against the Sandinista government there. The Contras are essentially terrorists conducting attacks on civilians throughout Nicaragua. There's good evidence, although Congress would never touch that during the Iran-Contra hearings, that the United States was also turning its head the other way, or possibly even facilitating the transshipment of drugs from Latin America into the United States, and the resources for that were being used to fund the Contras. There was a long series of articles a couple years ago in the San Jose Mercury by an investigative reporter named Gary Webb about this connection, the Contra cocaine connection, and by and large, pressure was put on the newspaper to kill it, and they did publish it, but later they basically abandoned Gary Webb, and he was left to his own devices. But quite ironically, some government investigations since then have shown that there's some good reason to suggest this was the case. In fact, in the mid-1980s, there was the Nicaraguans shot down an American pilot, a guy named Eugene Hassenfuss, who was shipping goods back and forth to the Contras, and he claimed that there were drug shipments being made. And I think Hassenfuss died under kind of weird circumstances. Actually, Barry Sadler, the guy who wrote the Bout of the Green Berets, died at that time. He was training the Contras in Nicaragua. I don't think he died under mysterious circumstances, but just a little bit of trivia there. So in El Salvador, Nicaragua, in Guatemala, the U.S. supports murderous regimes who kill, it's now been revealed, over 250,000 Guatemalans from 1954 to the 1980s, mostly Maya Indians. Okay? So the U.S. is acting very aggressively. The Vietnam syndrome, despite talk about it all the time, doesn't seem to be impairing the United States from acting in ways that it had before Vietnam. I'm not sure that Vietnam is stopping them. This idea that we can't act anymore, we have one hand tied behind our back, again, I think doesn't really stand up to the evidence. You see that in Latin America, the Iran-Contra scandal. I mean, some of the stuff that was revealed there was really quite striking. Remember, there were laws that Congress passed to prevent Reagan from supporting the Contras with military equipment, kind of like the War Powers Act. What did Reagan do? He skirted these. What he did was start selling military equipment to Iran, which violated several laws because Iran was on the list of terrorist states, especially since the hostage crisis. Take the proceeds from that and use those to support the Contras. And there were all kinds of interconnections between the Contras and, for example, the National Security Council and Oliver North, who was their conduit. The Contras had an office in Washington, D.C. on Wisconsin Avenue. Right? This is all part of the Vietnam syndrome. I mean, Reagan didn't feel constrained. Others would say he didn't invade Vietnam because of the Vietnam syndrome. That may be true, and if it is, it's because the military didn't want to go. I remember speaking to a lot of people at that time, military officers who, had been officers in Vietnam who said the last thing they wanted to do was fight in Nicaragua or El Salvador or Cuba or somewhere like that. They wanted no part of that. And I know, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, people like General Jones and Admiral Crowe, clearly were on record that way too. So again, this idea that the U.S. was hamstringed, I mean, if so, it's because the military understood the lessons of it, but clearly politicians did not feel that way. You see that in the invasion of Panama in 1989 and in the Gulf crisis of 1990 and 91. As I said a few minutes earlier, Bob Woodward, investigative reporter for the Washington Post, who puts out a new book every 2 or 3 weeks, and he's an insider, so he has access to people, but actually wrote a fairly good book on the military, the commanders, before which is about Panama and the Gulf War. And in both of these cases, it's quite striking how reluctant the military was to get involved. And I mean, Vietnam clearly is part of the debate, the memory of Vietnam, but it's the civilians who really don't mention that at all. I mean, to the civilians, Panama and Iraq are simply issues that need to be settled. And so the fact that the military is against it, just as they were against Vietnam in the early stages, doesn't mean a whole lot. And so even though the vast majority of military officers, for example, in the Gulf War, wanted the sanctions to continue, there were hearings in late 1990 at which the three previous chairs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Jones, Crow, and I forget the third, testified that it was too early to start the war and that sanctions should be allowed to continue. Powell and Schwarzkopf in their memoirs both said the same thing, didn't matter. So again, what's this Vietnam syndrome mean? A series of interventions continues throughout that period. The U.S. is aggressive and interventionist into the 1970s and 80s. If Vietnam did anything, though, I would suggest it changed the form of this. In the 1980s, the rage becomes something called LIC. This becomes kind of the hot thing among military thinkers, which stands for low-intensity conflict. Low-intensity conflict and covert operations become the way to do this rather than direct intervention, although in Panama and Iraq, you do get direct intervention. But in places like Guatemala, in Iran, in Lebanon, in Cuba, in the early Cold War, you have low-intensity conflict. By the 1980s, you start to see a resurgence of this in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Central America, in Africa, and elsewhere. So Vietnam, in that regard, actually may be an aberration. I mean, the fact that the United States intervened en masse in a place like this is really striking. You know, Korea is about the only thing that I think similar to that politically. Korea, World Wars I and II are global wars. Spanish-American War clearly has global ramifications. The U.S. takes Hawaii and Puerto Rico, and Cuba gets access to that out of the Spanish-American War. Even the Mexican War, you acquire Texas and California. Korea and Vietnam are fairly localized, which is why they're aberrations, and I'm not sure what kind of lessons can be drawn from them. The relevant lessons, actually, I think, may be applied from the other side. Remember when I read to you John Kerry's very moving account from the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. John Kerry suggested that maybe the most lasting impression Vietnam will have is when people go down the street and see soldiers and ask why they're like that or what happened. They can say Vietnam, and it'll mean that America recognized what had happened there and learned a lesson from it. Clearly, people who were cognizant of Vietnam in the 1980s used that quite frequently. One of the major bumper stickers of the time was El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam. The idea there meaning, look, you did this 20 years ago, it's time to watch it. So you have a burgeoning peace movement. People really got a sense, I think, from the Vietnam era that you couldn't trust your government. This idea that my government, right or wrong, just kind of flew out the window. People began to get very cynical, and of course Watergate compounded that deeply. I mean, when you have Vietnam on one hand, where it's quite clear that this light at the end of the tunnel talk isn't happening, and then you have Watergate, there's a real sense that Americans no longer can put their trust in their national leaders. And LBJ and Nixon really are reviled by large numbers of Americans toward the end there. That's one reason Jimmy Carter gets elected. I mean, Carter gives them this, he's totally different. He's the anti-politician. He says, you can trust me. I want a government as decent as the American people are, and so forth. So Carter is kind of the antithesis of that. He's the perfect candidate for the post-Vietnam era. There's a real sense that you can't trust the government anymore, and you have not just the right, but almost a duty to oppose it when it's engaged in these kinds of activities. This used to be considered a fairly radical idea. By the 1980s, 70s and 80s, I mean, basically average Americans now are being quite cautious in supporting government activity. A lot of thinking, a lot of critical thought is going on, and there's a burgeoning peace movement. I mean, the Vietnam generation is quite different in that regard in terms of its skepticism. I mean, you probably don't see as much of that in the World War II generation. The World War II generation, elects one of its own president throughout the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower. and they're very comfortable with him. Kennedy is a World War II veteran. Bill Clinton is the first president since 1945 who has no connection to World War II. That's fairly striking. I mean, FDR was elected in '32, and so from 1932 to 1992, for 60 years, American presidents had a connection to one single four-year war. And you will see now, I think, that the Vietnam generation probably will be similar to that in the coming years, where presidents will have a connection to Vietnam, and what they got out of that will be very important. Clinton is real striking because I'm talking about the peace movement. Clinton was part of that. His political opponents are trying to turn him into some kind of leader of the anti-war movement, and I've seen nothing to that. I think he went to a few anti-war rallies when he was at Oxford. I mean, Clinton's biggest issue was taking care of himself and trying to figure out how he could win the New Hampshire primary in 1968. But there was an active peace movement at home, and I think it learned the lessons of Vietnam. Mobilize quickly, be determined, and constantly try to remind people of Vietnam. I mean, there's a sense of history there. So when the United States intervenes in places like Bosnia, in places like Haiti, Somalia, the newspapers are full of references to Vietnam. Will this be another Vietnam? What does Vietnam mean to us? And so forth. However, I would also suggest that I'm not sure that restrains anybody. As soon as, for instance, Clinton began the air war in Kosovo in March, even though there were plenty of people saying, is this another Vietnam? Basically the media in the country supported it for the most part. At the same time, I'm not sure it's very good history. Is this another Vietnam? I mean, when I first came down here, Clinton had decided to send American troops to Bosnia, basically peacekeepers, and all these radio shows were trying to find professors and whatnot. And the first question I would get is this another Vietnam? Well, no, not really. But they don't want to hear that answer. So you kind of have to say, well, no, but then you say your piece, and then they kind of edit it so that it sounds like you're saying, yeah, they are relevant. Vietnam was very unique, and I'm not sure that Iraq, in retrospect, had no relevance to Vietnam at all. It's a war in which the enemy parks his tanks in a desert and lets you shoot them, lets you blow them up. Ho Chi Minh never did that. He's a little smarter than Saddam Hussein in that way, so I'm not sure what the legacy. Yeah.
I've heard that Desert Storm was an aberration. That'll never happen again.
Well, the Army thinks so because the Air Force takes credit for winning it. It'd be hard to imagine a situation like that. That was pretty unique. When the build-up, I mean, that's when the talk of Vietnam was really striking. The build-up to the Gulf War, on both sides. Remember, after the war ends, well, before that, was it January 16th or 15th? January 15th, maybe, when Bush actually sends the first planes to attack. He goes on TV and basically says, this is going to be different than Vietnam. No hands will be tied behind backs for this one. And then at the end, in March, he announces, by God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome. So what Clinton was saying was that, Iraq wasn't Vietnam. People who were opposed to the Gulf War were saying, this is another Vietnam. And again, I just don't think it held water on either side. But I mean, the connections, the references to Vietnam were just constant throughout that entire period. Yeah.
But in Bosnia, it seems that the syndrome was working from this standpoint. It's the very first thing that the president announced when he said we're putting this coalition together was, we won't need ground troops. We will never commit U.S. ground troops. Now, no military commander would ever want to start a war by saying we're not going to use ground troops if you truly just wanted to go in and win. Whether you thought it or not, that's not what you would do in announcing to your enemy that that was the way you were going to do it. But because of Vietnam and because of the specter of body bags coming home, he decides right up front to say that. Whereas I think in the Gulf War, on the other hand, they said, well, we may need them, but it's going to take a long time before we'll ever get there with them, and we amassed, 500,000 troops before they ever went in. So I think that in Clinton's case, it was a little bit of a Vietnam syndrome because he knew he would not have the public support.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, even in the Gulf War, I mean, certain things were clearly done to avoid Vietnam, mobilizing the reserves. That's the first thing, Bush did was, the Pennsylvania National Guard was going to go over and people like that. Actually, one of the few major losses of life was one of the Guard units there. I can't remember. There was a bomb hit a barracks or something like that. May have been Pennsylvania National Guard or something like that. Yeah, I mean, again, as I said, I'm kind of giving a somewhat provocative account, but clearly there are exceptions to it. Well, the idea now, whenever the military is deployed, the idea that we're not going to take any casualties, which is just striking. That's outrageous. I mean, I don't know if I'm not in favor of the loss of life, but for military people to go into a war with the main characteristic or the main goal being to not lose anybody is just amazing. I mean, throughout history, I can't ever imagine that. I mean, in Haiti, we're not going to lose anybody, or in Somalia. I mean, in Somalia, 22 Americans were killed and they ran out. In the recent Kosovo, air attacks, no Americans dead. At some point, this is going to come back and bite you when you, determine engagement based on the idea that we can't lose anybody. This is what, John Paul Van was criticizing No Din Siem for. And, that runs counter to military doctrine throughout the ages. So, no, I'm not suggesting that nothing's coming out. I mean, in 1985 or so, Caspar Weinberger, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, put forth a list of 4 or 5, guidelines that the United States had to meet before it should send troops into battle. And these were, clearly based on the Vietnam experience. One of them was to have the public behind you. Another was to have a declaration of war. Another was to have already a plan and a strategy in place and things like that. And clearly there was a perception that we didn't do this in Vietnam and we had to do it then. I think Harry Summers' work was really instrumental in this. Summers, one of his big arguments was that the U.S. failed miserably by not having a declaration of war, by kind of going in dribs and drabs and using the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and so forth. Johnson didn't want a declaration of war. He didn't want the Americans to get all fired up and alarmed that the United States was at war. That's why he didn't mobilize the reserves. That's why he didn't mobilize the economy. He wanted to do this on the cheap and on the quick to get back to business at home, which was more important to him. I think we say. I mean, when I suggest that, I'm not saying there's no Vietnam syndrome. What I'm suggesting is the idea that the United States has been restrained or handcuffed, I have real issues with. Clearly, people have changed. And I think people who oppose, government policy have learned a great deal from the Vietnam era. I also don't think they are, they haven't stopped the wars either. And so I'm not sure what that means. Maybe the greatest, actually, impact the Vietnam has had has been culturally, in things like movies and film and music and so forth. And this is real hard to get a beat on because pop culture basically is a commodity to be bought and sold. And one of the great ironies, maybe tragedies, is that you can take a message which is really anti-government or very pacifist or whatever and turn it into a profit-making vehicle that everybody can identify with. And so you see that a lot too. I think culturally Vietnam and the Vietnam generation are quite powerful. They're quite powerful legacies. Movies, I mean, things like Rambo, especially the one with, like I said, I have Alzheimer's. The one with Gene Hackman and on the POWs. The Clint Eastwood movies on POWs. Throughout the 1980s, this became kind of a major, Hollywood selling point. We're going to do a movie about Vietnam. Conversely, who was the villain in all these things, or the nut? It was always some Vietnam vet. This deranged veteran tends to be kind of the outcast and kind of the crazy guy and all this. This guy who was, kind of done wrong in Vietnam and knows how to use guns, which again was outrageous. I mean, Vietnam vets, from any statistics I've seen, don't have a higher rate of homicide or anything else than anybody else does, than their cohorts in the civilian population. Yet this becomes a staple. And part of it is, we've done them wrong, and the other part was they weren't allowed to win. You see that in Rambo. So culturally, there's this, every novel at the time, not every novel, but many novels at the time are set in Vietnam or have a Vietnam veteran as one of the protagonists in them. Vietnam-era novelists, Vietnam veteran novelists become quite popular. Tim O'Brien, probably the best known of that group, but Philip Caputo, A Rumor of War, O'Brien, Going After Cacciato was his first book. Robert Mason, Chicken Hawk. I mean, just tons of books set in Vietnam. Linda Van Devanter, Piece of My Heart, which talks about nurses in Vietnam, something that I haven't mentioned, which is really unfortunate because, again, there's another area like Chicanos, African Americans, so many areas that more and more work needs to be done on. There's almost nothing done on women in Vietnam, as Ron was saying. I mean, they see it every day. They're see people come in wounded and bloodied and bullet ridden, whereas men in combat don't see it that often. They're kind of in and out. Where these nurses see it every day, and it's incredibly powerful experience for them. Linda Van de Vanter wrote a book on that called Home Before Morning, which is quite telling. I mean, Vietnam becomes quite popular culturally. The music of the Vietnam era, it's still considered the golden age of rock and roll. The protest songs of that era, Country Joe McDonald is still featured on like MTV and VH1. I feel like I'm fixing to die rag, kind of the anthem of that entire period. Courses in the Vietnam War begin to be taught in the 1970s. The first ones were taught in the kind of mid to late 70s. Were quite popular at the time. I mean, the war had just barely ended. The first major book on Vietnam was George Herring's, scholarly book was George Herring's America's Longest War. And clearly there'd been a lot of other books, but Herring was the first historian to really kind of write a nice little book that you could use in courses. And it's been wildly popular. It's sold, tons and tons of copies from that time on. Vietnam courses were popular throughout the 70s and 80s, remain so today. There's a real thirst for it. Movies set in Vietnam or having something to do with Vietnam are quite popular, or movies which kind of gave a different twist to the Vietnam era. I've ran and raved about Forrest Gump before. I'm not going to do that again. But I think culturally the war really kind of lives on. The whole ethic of the 1960s, that whole kind of zeitgeist really remains very strong. And everything I think was connected to the war at that point. I mean, without the war, it's counterfactual again. Without the war, how would things have gone? Well, we don't know. But you can assume that it would have been a lot different. I mean, you have a civil rights movement which would have remained probably the dominant national issue. One can assume it would. A war on poverty which may or may not have been waged more intensely, but one can assume it might have been. All this stuff probably occurs differently. You don't have this massive national debate, this divisive debate. You don't have, literally millions of people participating in a movement to end the war. Government credibility may have remained stronger because, I mean, clearly the lies, and there's no other word to use but lies to describe what had happened in Vietnam, had kept building up. So it really changes everything. You can't look back from 1999 and not see Vietnam as a really defining event. Economically, very important. I mean, you take $200 to $300 billion, maybe more, out of circulation and you spend it on a war, and you're not really getting a return on that. Louis Galambos, who's an economic historian, said this is probably the greatest economic catastrophe in American history, because that money, $200 to $300 billion, might have been spent on research and development. It could have been put into discovering new technologies or medical research or whatever, and instead it was spent with no return in Vietnam, which creates an inflationary spiral, a series of budget deficits, increased defense spending. I mean, in 1950, the U.S. defense budget was $13 billion. So in 1950. 25 years later, it was up, 25, 30 years later, it's up in the $300 billion range. Okay, this is a 25-fold increase. That's incredible. Okay, I mean, in just about 2 to 3 decades, and this has a huge impact on the economy. Now, for a time, it's very profitable. Working class folk in the 50s and 60s, in some measure because of Vietnam, do quite well. Employment is high, wages are high, and until Vietnam kicks in, inflation is fairly low. So Vietnam at first has something of a booster effect, but then when the global economic situation worsens, it hits home in the United States as well. Everybody always says that it was the oil crisis which really changed the world economy. I think it occurs before that. I think it's because of the war. The United States is spending, tens, hundreds of billions of dollars with no return on it, taking that money out of circulation where it might be used for investment or for trade, research, development, whatever, education, and instead using it to fight the war in Vietnam. So one of the aftermaths of the war, one of the strong aftermaths of the war is, of course, the economy. Culturally and socially, some of the things we talked about at the beginning, what it means to race relations in the United States. There was a perception based on good statistical data, too, I think, that minorities were overrepresented in combat units among casualties in Vietnam. Now, many veterans of color remain patriotic and very proud of their duty. but there are also members of both communities, which many of those communities, which see Vietnam as kind of another example. You know, why did we spend that much time and effort in Vietnam when we didn't deal with problems here at home? And this is an argument that remains true. And again, I think one of the legacies of the war in Vietnam. So what you see are always kind of next Vietnams. Is this the next Vietnam? You know, people are always mobilizing for war. Is Haiti the next Vietnam? Is Bosnia the next Vietnam? Was Nicaragua the next Vietnam? Is Kosovo the next Vietnam? Is China the next Vietnam? Is Vietnam the next Vietnam? Who knows? Yeah.
In that sense, could it be argued that perhaps we might even be a little more aggressive in the sense that we're going to make sure we don't look like that again, and so we have to prove what we felt we failed to prove in Vietnam with one more intervention after another?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think when there's actually a commitment, as in Panama or as in Iraq, you're going to see overwhelming force, or as in Kosovo, you're going to see overwhelming force. I'm not sure that that's a product of the Vietnam War. I mean, that's kind of always the way Americans have fought. It's the way they fought in Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam was the wrong war at the wrong place. You know, politically, the U.S. just was on the wrong side. You know, doesn't mean not wrong in the sense of morally right or wrong, but wrong in the sense of politically and strategically. It was on the wrong side. It was on the side that was going to lose because of the history, I mean, of that era, of that region. You know, will it? I don't know if it'll become more aggressive or not. There are all kinds of local conditions. But I think, you know, whenever this happens, you're going to, at least for another 20 years, you're going to hear references to Vietnam because, you know, people who are now in positions of power politically, who are in the media, remember that. Right? You know, the current crop of politicians, John Kerry, who was active in VVAW as a U.S. Senator, Max Cleland, who lost 2 legs in Vietnam, lost both his legs in Vietnam, is now a senator from Georgia. He had headed the Veterans Administration before that. Bob Kerry, a senator from Nebraska, is a Vietnam veteran who Medal of Honor winner, has had one leg, lost a leg in Vietnam, right? I mean, the list is quite long among politicians. I mean, Gore was a veteran. He actually was in Vietnam as a journalist. Bush, questions of Bush's service will be raised. John McCain was a POW in that era. So, you know, this clearly, politically, is a Vietnam generation too. The World War II generation is seeded now. They're out of the picture, so to speak. Dan Quayle, when he was still in the race, you know, controversies over his background. Pat Buchanan didn't go to Vietnam. So, I mean, this is really kind of going to be a real question, and you're going to see this, you know, for at least another generation. Are you going to, yeah? Yeah,
I don't know if we learned anything economically from fighting the war in Vietnam, because look at Desert Storm, the Gulf War. We spent $1 billion a day over there. We couldn't have done that for much longer.
Yeah. Well, you know, and consider what they. Well, one of the things about the Gulf War, actually, one thing I never mentioned with regard to Vietnam is basically throughout the entire war, the U.S. went it alone, but there were token signs of support elsewhere. South Korea, 20 to 30,000 soldiers. Australia, about that many. A few Thais, and not much else. And one thing the U.S. was always really, you know, kind of antsy about was the idea that this was an American war, and they were trying to find others to say, no, this is an Allied war, but they never could pull it off. But in the Gulf, I mean, they basically go out and buy a coalition. They forgave Egypt and Saudi Arabia, I mean, billions of dollars in debts. They increased the amount of money and aid they gave to a lot of the Mideastern countries. They gave the Soviet Union, what, like $4 billion or something like that. So essentially, with regard to the Gulf War, in order to make this a united effort, you know, they go out and spend a ton of money. The Gulf War also had that kind of oil thing there that you don't have in Vietnam. So what's this all mean? Are there any lessons? I don't know. I mean, as a historian, you're supposed to have a nice little outline with 4 different lessons or something. I really don't know. The one thing, the more I study history, I'm convinced of is that, you know, anybody can do anything they want with it. George Orwell once said, whoever controls the past controls the present. Whoever controls the present, therefore, controls the future. And what he meant was that those people who write history and teach it basically set the stage for what happens today. And if I can convince a large mass of people about a particular thing in the past, they were done wrong or they were aggrieved or whatever, then I can mobilize that and use it for the present. And I think that's clearly the case on Vietnam. Ronald Reagan was able to do that, to convince Americans that Vietnam was in fact a noble cause, and the media and the anti-war movement and weak politicians, lost it, and that soldiers were betrayed by Walter Cronkite and others. He convinced enough people that that became a factor. So what are the lessons? I mean, they're quite different depending on what your perspective is. You can ask a combat veteran, you can ask an anti-war protester, you can ask a politician, and they're going to give you 3 different answers of what they are. Has anybody learned anything from it? I don't know. Not a comforting opinion. But you saw, I mean, there's an interest. A lot of people were out at the wall a few weeks ago in Washington, D.C., when the wall was unveiled. It just unleashes these emotions, not just from people who were there, from those who lost family members or friends there. I mean, people who had nothing to do with it, school kids and, all kinds of folks from all walks of life see that and are moved by it, and they're thinking about it, which I think as a professor at least is the best, it's the most I can hope for. Think about these things, what they mean to you. These are all, intensely intimate and personal ideas. But other than that, I don't know, so lessons, legacies, I'm not real sure. Okay, any last questions? Okay, they're yellow lighting me again.
Thanks for a great course.
Thank you.